historically as a result of the destruction of the Somnath temple. She shows the following. 150 years after the destruction of the temple, a Hindu king rebuilt the Somnath temple without even a mention of Mahmud having destroyed it. More important, 250 years later, land was given to a Muslim trader to build a mosque on the land belonging to the same temple's estates, with the approval of the local Hindu ruler, local merchants, and priests. No sign of trauma. There is no sign of trauma in the collective memory of Hindus visible until it was a memory constructed much later under colonial patronage by their allies, the religious communal forces. Destruction of religious places was routinely done, and they were done across religions and sects, often to loot the wealth of those institutions or to establish authority in the ancient and medieval times, and was treated, it appears from Professor Thapar's account, as such. It didn't create any permanent trauma. Nehru himself had a much more nuanced account of Mahmud Ghazni than that portrayed by the colonial communal combine, where he sees him, I'm quoting Nehru, as far more a warrior than a man of faith, who used his army raised in India under a Hindu general named Tilak against his own co-religionists, Muslims, rulers in Central Asia. So the issue was not Hindu-Muslim, is what Nehru is emphasizing. The nationalist intelligentsia in the colonial period put forward a totally different interpretation of Indian history from the colonial communal one that I just mentioned, where they were not trying to create memories of historical trauma to create differences in the present. On the contrary, they drew on the reality of Indian society and how it organically dealt with religious, caste, and other differences through birth of new religions like Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism, or movements spanning many centuries like the Sufi and the Bhakti movements. Nehru perhaps best argues this position in his magisterial magnum opus, The Discovery of India. The lessons that Nehru tried to draw from Indian history were connected to his imagining India's future as a modern, democratic country based on Enlightenment values, which we call the idea of India. He focused on a critical aspect of India's civilizational history, which is an openness to reason and rationality, a questioning mind and acceptance of multiple claims to truth, a dialogical tradition of being in conversation and discussion with each other, the ability to live with difference, accommodate, adjust, resolve, and transform rather than violently crush difference. It's interesting, as you all know, that decades later, this is a point that Amartya Sen has been making repeatedly in his two celebrated works, The Idea of Justice and The Argumentative Indian. This is exactly, or virtually in Nehru's words, he draws precisely these conclusions from our ancient past till today. Nehru draws from the Indus Valley civilization, the Rig Veda, the Upanishads, the epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata, the Gita, Buddha, Ashoka, Alauddin Khilji, Amir Khusro, Akbar, Vivekanand to Gandhi to illustrate the above, these processes I discussed. He emphasized also how the shared tradition in language, music, poetry, painting, architecture, philosophy, and everyday practice, cutting across religion and caste, contributed to the creation of a composite culture. While talking of songs composed by Amir Khusro, he said, I'm quoting, "I do not know if there is any other instance anywhere of songs written 600 years ago by Amir Khusro, which are sung till today in all exactly the same words, by people, by millions across the country, cutting across all religions." He talked of the emergence of the Indian civilization that occurred over the centuries through the absorption, assimilation, and synthesis of all the influences India was exposed to through trade, invasions, migration, intermixing. From the Indus Valley civilization 5,000 years ago to the Dravidian, I'm quoting him, Aryan, Central Asian, Iranian, Greek, Parthian, Bactrian, Scythian, Hun, Arab, Turk, early Christian, Jewish, Zoroastrian, Afghan, and Mughal influences, all, as he says, leaving their mark. And in his beautiful language, he says, like some ancient palimpsest on which layer upon layer of thought and reverie had been inscribed, and yet no succeeding layer was completely hidden or erased what had been written previously. It is to this organic process through which the Indian people had learnt to negotiate difference of multiple religious languages, caste, etc., that colonialism came as a shock. It is as if Indian history ceased, that is, stopped, to use a phrase used by the African revolutionary Amilcar Cabral. Indian history ceased for virtually 200 years. Colonialism not only stopped the dynamic process of negotiating difference, but actually froze or even actuated these differences. And the communal forces were the chief instruments in the hands of accomplishing this task of accentuating these differences. The world has learnt at a very heavy cost, from Ireland, the oldest colony, to recent events in Palestine, about which Nehru has a lot to say, the role of imperialism in what is happening in Palestine today. The world has learnt from all this and the experiences of large parts of Asia and Africa, including India, that the longest lasting legacy of colonialism is not economic backwardness. The longest lasting legacy of colonialism has been that it left behind a divided people, as we are learning today. One method used by the colonial communal forces to create a religious divide, of which Nehru was very critical, was the colonial periodization of Indian history, which was done, as you know, by James Mill in the early 19th century into three major periods: the ancient or Hindu, the Muslim, and the British period. Nehru is very critical of it as early as the 1930s. He says, it is unscientific to divide history like this. This division is neither intelligent nor correct. It is deceptive and gives a wrong perspective. It deals more with the superficial changes at the top than with the essential changes in the political, economic, and cultural development of the Indian people. He continues to say, it is wrong and misleading to talk of Muslim invasion of India or of the Muslim period in India, just as it would be wrong to refer to the coming of the British to India as a Christian invasion, or to call the British period in India a Christian period. He questioned the defining of a period by just the religion of the ruler and emphasized the wider social and economic and cultural factors which defined a period, and also pointed out the continuities and the cultural intermixing of people belonging to different religious faiths. Later historians, almost every major historians that you know of in India, have confirmed Nehru's position on this, critiquing the colonial communal periodization of Indian history. I mention this only to say that he spearheaded this. Nehru was extremely critical of looking at history with the, I'm quoting, the old and completely out-of-date approach of a record of doings of kings and battles and such like. He said, the whole conception of history of a country being the names of a large number of kings and emperors and our learning them by heart is long dead. I'm quite sure, unfortunately he was wrongly sure, whether in the schools and colleges of India it has ceased to exist or not. But I hope at any rate that it is dead, because anything more futile than children's study of the record of kings, regions, and battles, I cannot imagine. On the contrary, Nehru anticipated what is now globally an accepted norm in cutting-edge historiography. He emphasized the social aspects of history. I'm quoting Nehru. He said, much closer research into the daily lives of the common man, maybe in family budgets, 100 or 1,000 years ago, which makes us realize something of what the life of humanity was in the past age. As he put it in his characteristically beautiful prose, he says, it is only then that we really clothe the dry bones of history with life, flesh, and blood. Nehru was deeply aware of the various biases in history, in the writing of history, and very critical of the Eurocentric stroke colonial approaches, which often overlapped and which unfortunately exercised considerable influence, including in the former colonies till today. Giving the inaugural address to the Asian History Congress, Nehru said, the immediate object of History Congress should be to straighten out all the twists which Asian history has received at the hands of the Europeans. While some of them are very fine historians, their approach has nevertheless been based on Europe being the center of the world. He continued, in the case of India, a Western scholar, especially from the United Kingdom, inevitably tended to look at the history of India as if the past few thousand years were a kind of a preparation for the coming British dominion in India. However, Nehru warned that as a reaction to that, sometimes our own historians have gone too far. There is a nationalist history which, starting from a strong nationalist bias, praises everything that is national at the expense of other things. As early as 1930s, reacting to the tendency to imagine a quote-unquote a golden age in the past, which the communalists used to create a religious division, he said, everywhere are to be found people who consider their own country the best and regard it as sacred soil. They only study their ancient history and award it a high place. It becomes Satya Yuga or Ram Rajya, and the hope remains that the same may be restored. He argued both these approaches, the nationalist approach and the imperialist approach, distort history. They sometimes suppress history. Nehru showed in his own writings, particularly in the Glimpses of World History and also the Discovery of India, how one could be firmly anti-imperialist and also have pride in one's own history for the genuine achievements without resorting to blind, imaginary glorification of one's past, overlooking all the warts and blemishes. I'll have more to say of this at the end of my address. While on the subject of Eurocentric colonial positions, Nehru very early on refutes the tendency to obfuscate the difference between the empires of the ancient and medieval period and the modern colonial empires emerging with the rise of capitalism. This is a tendency which has shockingly continued till today. He says, thank you, Nadeem sir. So kind of you. So kind of you. He says, as early as 1933, there have been vast empires for thousands of years, but modern imperialism is a new concept developed for the first time in recent years. But very few of us have understood its real import and often mistake it for imperialism of the old. Unless we understand this new imperialism properly and discern its roots and branches, we cannot grasp the conditions of the present-day world and cannot properly wage our battle for freedom. This confusion between pre-modern empires and the colonial empires, as Nehru says, has continued till today, and all you have to do is read, for example, Frederick Cooper and Jane Burbank's work called Empire in World History to see that this is being argued globally, even till today, by many people. Throughout the pages of the voluminous glimpses of history, world history, Nehru maintains and highlights the clear distinction and explains the very complex evolution of modern imperialism. Nehru repeatedly questions the colonial characterization picked up by the communalists of the medieval period when many of the rulers in India were Muslims as foreign rule, clearly distinguishing it from British colonial rule, which he described as foreign rule. Lest all of you think that one is stating the obvious, or that Nehru was stating the obvious, one may point out that our current Prime Minister repeatedly from the ramparts of the Red Fort in his Independence Day speech, his speech in Parliament as Prime Minister in 2014, his address to the US Congress in 2023, I'm just citing 3 instances, there are several more, he reiterates the RSS position and talks of 1,000 years of foreign rule in India. You can see how important the distinction that Nehru is making. With one stroke, all Muslim rulers were declared as foreigners from whose alleged loot and slavery India had to win independence. Look at the paradox. The forces which did not play a part in the actual struggle against foreign rule, that is the actual struggle against British imperialism, except to join them to fight the national movement, they now talk of freedom from a so-called Muslim rule in the medieval period. So the modern imperialism was not questioned, but a medieval foreign rule is what they are now trying to liberate India from. Nehru commented on this aspect, distinguishing the medieval period when many rulers were Muslim in India from the British period. And let me just quote him a bit on this. He says, the so-called Hindu ancient period is vast and full of change, of growth and decay, and then growth again. What is called the Muslim or medieval period brought in another change, and an important one, and yet it was more or less confined to the top and did not vitally affect the essential continuity of Indian life. The invaders who came to India from the northwest, like so many of their predecessors in more ancient times, became absorbed into India and part of our life. Their dynasties became Indian dynasties, and there was a great deal of racial fusion by intermarriage. A deliberate effort was made, apart from a few exceptions, not to interfere with the ways and customs of the people. They looked to India as their home country and had no other affiliations. India continued to be an independent country. The coming of the British made a vital difference, and the old system was uprooted in many ways. They brought an entirely different impulse from the West, which had slowly developed in Europe and was taking shape in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. The British remained outsiders, aliens, and misfits in India and made no attempt to be otherwise. Above all, for the first time in India's history, her political control was exercised from outside, and her economy was centered in a distant place. He's using language that is used by Marxists even now, especially the world system analysts. They use exactly the language that Nehru is using in the 1930s. They made India a typical colony of the modern age, a subject country for the first time in her long history. A few more points, since I'm talking to distinguished historians, I'm going to focus. This is a very long address. I'll read only part 1 and 2. The rest I'll summarize in 3 minutes. Because the first part is Nehru and the discipline of history. I thought I'll just focus on that. That is what I was advised. And the other parts, Nehru's contribution to the making of modern India, you can read in my address. A few more points on Nehru and history writing, which are relevant today. From very early on, Nehru was a votary of looking at history in a global context, an exponent of what is now fashionably called connected histories. He said, the old idea of writing a history of any one country has become progressively out of date. It is impossible today to think of the history of a country isolated from the rest of the world. The world is getting integrated. We have to consider history today in a world perspective. Further, he said, it is quite impossible today to think of current events or of history in the making in terms of any one nation or country or patch of territory. You have inevitably to think of the world as a whole. As a man of action, one who contributed significantly to the making of modern India, Nehru saw the need to keep the big picture in mind while approaching history. Very wise words which our young students must pay attention to. He said, it has been given to us in the present age to play a part in the making of history. And for a person who does that, it becomes an even more important thing to understand the process of history so that he may not lose himself in trivial details and forget the main sweep. He urged historians not to get lost in the details so that they may see the wood a little more and not be lost in the individual tree. Any subject, he said, that you may investigate should be viewed in relation to a larger whole. Otherwise, it has no real meaning except as some odd incident which might interest you and your friends. Again, as a man of action, Nehru urged historians that they should not always write only for their brother historians, for the charmed circle of people who are interested in a specifically narrow aspect. They should try to appeal to the minds of the larger public, the intelligent or semi-intelligent public. He did not believe, and this is important, he did not believe that popularization means a deviation from scholarship. I do not think there is any necessary conflict between real scholarship and a popular approach. Unless the masses understand it, our labor, he said, would be in vain, and books should be written keeping this in mind. Some of the tallest scholars in India, inspired by the Nehruvian dream, did try to do what he desired, writing school textbooks, popular pamphlets, and books which are understood popularly. From R.S. Sharma, Romila Thapar, Bipin Chandra, Satish Chandra, Irfan Habib, D.N. Jha, Arjun Dev, Shireen Muswi, Ranbir Chakravarti, Upinder Singh. I mean, I can go on. The tallest of the Indian scholars have kept what Nehru has said in mind, and that is why it is so difficult for the current forces to challenge and overthrow the historical worldview that has been created in India. Finally,